Goodness, that's probably too nice for me. Hey, welcome to Vice Grip Garage. This is part 2 of 3 of a Chevy Big Block budget build. In part 1, we assembled this short block here. Today in part 2, we're going to put the heads on, complete the valve train installation, and I'm going to show you a common mistake when choosing head gaskets that could affect your compression ratio and rob you some horsepower, as well as the right way to set your rocker arm geometry and a very fast and easy way to set your hydraulic lifter preload. That seems like a lot of work. Anyway, let's just, that meant dig in. Whatever. Let's go. Well, let's jump right into it. We're going to start with head gaskets. And I can't tell you guys how many times I've been at the parts store and, well, it's probably like 13 or 14, but anywho, I'm in line at the parts store and feller comes up and, yep, building a hot rod engine for the old Maverick or whatever it is. And I need a head gasket, and they say, well, just give me what's ever in stock. And X brand is slid over the counter and they leave. And I'm just blinking like, hey, guy, you forgot to ask 2 very important questions, and we're going to get to that in a second. Before we get to the head gasket itself, we've got to understand compression ratio and how that works. Now, I'm not going to go into fine detail. David Freiberger explained this really well on a Roadkill Extra once, so you can go find that if you want the whole explanation. But essentially, there's a handful of things that affect your compression ratio, either raise or decrease it. That's going to be the bore, which is your cylinder opening right here. The stroke, which is how far your piston travels up and down. The design of your piston itself. A valve relief, a dish, a flat top, or a dome, like we have here. The combustion chamber of your head. This is an old set of camel hump heads here, which is this space here. Or this is an LS set of heads right here. And most commonly overlooked is your head gasket thickness and bore. So obviously, the smaller you can get that area in your combustion chamber, the higher your compression, right? Well, a lot of people overlook this, and when they purchase head gaskets, they're not asking what is the bore of the head gasket and what is the compressed thickness when I install this on my engine. And that can have a drastic effect, either positive or negative, on your overall compression ratio. Now, an important step when building an engine, and we didn't talk about this in step 1, is you really need to sit down and design your engine specifically for your build. And it's more than just your engine. What am I using the vehicle for? What are the intended purposes? What kind of gasoline or fuel do I want to run? Pump gas, 93, E85, so on and so forth. That determines your carburation and a lot of other things, or your fuel injection. All the way down to your torque converter, your transmission, your rear end gears, and the weight of your vehicle. Everything plays together, and you're going to need all of that anyway when you select your camshaft. But long story short, you're going to come up with a compression number right away in the beginning of your build. One of those key components is the compressed thickness of your head gasket. Now, this particular engine here, with pop-up pistons, my heads, and what I determined to be a 18 thousandths head gasket thickness, which is extremely thin, I should be at a 9.1 to 1, or very close. This here head gasket, when compressed, is 18 thousandths. It's a steel shim gasket. This is what GM used basically from the factory. They work really great on cast heads. Now, for example, if I were to change to a 40 thousandths or a 44 thousandths gasket, which is pretty common, that's going to drastically affect my compression ratio. That would take me from a 9.1, which is pretty lazy, but for forced induction is safe. It's going to take me from there all the way to about an 8.6, which is really sluggish. So you have to very closely pay attention to the compressed thickness of your head gasket. The other thing you need to pay close attention to is your bore. This is a 4.280 bore. This fits almost perfectly onto the block where the fire ring goes around the cylinder. However, there are some recesses on the side. So the overall bore is actually 4.370. So when you calculate your compression, you have to figure that in too. The most important thing is that this fire ring right here does not impede or overlap into your cylinder bore. But if it's larger than your bore, you're losing compression. There are a lot of calculators out there that are going to help you figure that out. I'm going to put this head gasket on quick, and then I'll bring you in close and I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about here. Wow, you little devil. So getting closer here, this ring right here is what I call the fire ring. And this is what we got to make sure is as close to the actual cylinder bore, see how close that is? But does not overlap into the bore itself. Now it's very common to have these kind of come off like this. That's completely normal. But they take that into consideration when they give you the measurement of the bore. So although this sounds considerably larger than 4.280, I can't go any smaller than this because I don't want this fire ring down into my cylinder bore. So now that I got these on, let's talk about the heads for a minute, and then we'll go ahead and install those. Other than the crank and rods, the other area that we could save a tremendous amount of money on this build and keep us down into the budget zone is on the heads. And knowing that I was already limiting myself with the stock rotating assembly down there other than the pistons, I built these 049s which I had on the shelf, and these are one of a handful of Chevy Big Block heads that are fairly sought after. There's a lot of them out there, but there's also a lot of folks looking for them. And if you just upgrade them with today's hardware, they perform really, really well, especially in a naturally aspirated world. But again, with forced induction, not really losing a lot of performance because I'm going to have to keep that tune down if I'm going to keep that crank alive. These here have been upgraded with 172-2190 stainless valves. Over here we've got rotator eliminators. Normally there's a stack in here and these springs sit up higher. Under high RPM or coil bind, that spring could jump out. We've eliminated that here so they don't walk. We've got comp springs, we've got 10-degree keepers, we've got ARP studs, and we've got 3/8 guide plates. Of course, they've been all cleaned and everything like that. So what I've got here, everything all in, machine work and parts, I've got $810 into these heads. In that value right there, these are absolutely specifically built for this camshaft. And to me, that's at least worth $100, right? Bolt these things on and run them. Now you can find Jackie Chan heads on Evil Bay or the Jungle website for Big Block Chevy. I just looked, $1,400, but you have no idea how accurate the castings are. You definitely don't know what kind of valves you're gonna have, and you're for sure gonna be changing your valve springs to match your installed height or your spring pressure or your max lift to your camshaft. So you're going to be putting more money into them anyway. And decent name brand heads for big blocks are usually $900 to $1,500 each. So by going this route, we're saving a tremendous amount of money, and it's going to be just fine for this short block. So I'm going to go ahead and just set these on here. A little bit more money up front for me. You don't have to use these, but I'm pretty confident that sometime in the future, we're going to be taking these heads off and maybe using a different set of cast heads, or maybe we'll be upgrading to aluminum heads. But my hope is I could just reuse some of this ARP hardware. Now, one of the huge downsides of this head is this thing is really heavy. So if you're into drag racing or something like that, you're really going to want to take that into consideration to see if aluminum heads might be worth it for you. There we go. When you hear twin fiddles and steel guitar, that has nothing to do with anything. I just, After a guy got the heads on and torquilated, I noticed I had quite the dangle going on the old engine stand here. So I put away my Kira Nightly one and traded it out for my Shakira stand. She's quite a bit thicker, you know. It's also taller, so it's in a guy's teeth better when we start into the valve train here. There's a couple things I want to snag back around to that I didn't show that are pretty important, so you might want to scooch forward there in your chair. One of them right away is, remember all that oil that we smeared into the cylinders here while we were installing our pistons? Some manufacturers actually say don't do that. But you got to remember, as a manufacturer, they're going to choose lesser of the evils basically. And they would rather risk you scratching up the cylinder bores a little bit and get a good seal on initial startup than have a guy forget and have a lot of excessive oil in there. So take a lint-free rag, come back and wipe out whatever remains. And if you remember in part 1, we talked about piston rings. Those oil rings should have scraped most of that down to the bottom, and then your compression ring should have pushed a lot of it to the top. So wipe them out, wipe the top of the piston off, roll it over maybe quarter, half of a turn, wipe it out again, make sure that's nice and clean. If a guy forgets, well, it might take a while for your rings to come back around. And in worst cases, you can actually glaze the piston, so we don't want to do that. I just always oil them up. I just want to make sure that the piston skirts are nice and lubricated as we install those. The other thing is you want to chase your threads in your block before you put your heads on. And make sure it's an actual chase bit, not one of them there tapper out or digger scraper ones. You don't want to take any material out because you might put yourself in a position where you strip one of these bolts. Uh-oh, that's not good. Speaking of bolts, this is pretty important. Yep, it is. When you get your hardware, some of the constructions say nothing. Others say, hey guy, maybe use some assembly lube or sealer. I don't know. So it's going to be up to you to research your particular engine and figure out which holes are blind holes and which holes are through holes. And that's fairly simple. A blind hole means that there's material underneath of it, so it's been milled or drilled into your block. A through hole means it goes right through into your block. And if that happens, 99.7342% chance, it's a water passage. So you're going to want to seal that up, or you're going to get water or coolant into your cylinder. Not good. I use Permatex 1 or 2, but there's 927 different flavors out there. You're going to have to decide what you want to do there. This is also handy to have when you go to put your heads on, and actually just for your build. Go onto the interwebs and type into the Google machine torque sequence and specs, and then you can just check these off as you go. I'm a fan of the red paint thing over here, which is, I just put some dots on these. I'm not putting them on here because I am eventually going to paint this, but I'm going to wait until after we dyno it in case we have any oil leaks or anything like that. Once I bring it back to the shop, I'll clean it down good and then we're going to paint it. One of the things I noticed is this gets a little confusing on the interwebs. There's like X's and lines and all these different patterns and stuff. For Big Block Chevy, I just remember by small circle to big circle. So if you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, you're done. Small to big circle. And you can also just throw this up here if you want. Do that. 3 equal torquilized sequences and get you done. If you don't have a nice clean thread and assembly lube or sealant on your bolts here, a guy could get a false positive on his torque spec. And a false positive is never good, fellers, especially in torques and pregnancy tests. The other thing you want to check while you're in this position here is go ahead and run down your studs if they're screw-in studs. Make sure those are torqued. For me, that's 50 foot-pounds. Again, you want to trust the feller, but you never know. These could be assembled on a Friday. Oof. Oof. Well, it's that time. Guy needs to figure out his proper push rod length here so I can completely assemble my valve train. This is a big milestone in any engine build, and from what I've been told, it's one that prevents a lot of fellers from even attempting a build. So I'm going to try to break this down for you pretty far today and hopefully make it a little bit easier to understand. There's a big misconception out there that I need to play with different push rod lengths to get my rocker arm geometry as close as I can. And it's actually the other way around. I'm going to show you today how to set your rocker arm geometry perfectly, and your push rod length is a result of this perfect geometry. In order to do that, I'm going to go upstairs to the Eagle's Nest here and run you through an art class. I'm going to try to illustrate this here so you can visualize and understand what proper rocker arm geometry is. Then we'll come down here and actually hands-on apply it and get this measured up. Proper rocker arm geometry is when your rocker arm is at a perfect 90-degree relationship to your valve at mid-lift. So before we go any farther, let's wrap our brain stem around those two things, and then the rest of this might make a little more sense. This is a typical roller rocker here, and two of the items that make up that 90-degree angle are right here. The center of your trunnion, the center of your roller tip, and the other one is your valve itself. This is supposed to be a valve, just squint at it, you know. So this is at 90 degrees if we were to take the body of the rocker arm away. The second thing is mid-lift. Two different ways to think about this. You can combine them, use one or the other, I don't care. But basically, that's when your push rod and lifter is halfway through your cam's lift, gross lift, or your valve spring is halfway through its max compressed height. As an example, the lift on this cam on the exhaust side is 671. So mid-lift, if I divide that by 2, is 0.336. We're going to need that in just a minute here. One of the things you're going to need to know before we can establish proper mid-lift is your rocker arm stud size. If you have a 3/8 stud, that's going to be 24 threads per inch or 42 thousandths of an inch per turn on your rocker nut. If you have 7/16 inch studs, that's 20 threads per inch or 50 thousandths per turn on your rocker nut. So if we come over here, the three basic steps we're going to be taking is we're going to establish initially a 90 degrees to the valve, and we're going to use the retainer on the spring because we know that that's parallel to the bottom of the valve. Then we're going to calculate half of our lift, which we've already done here. Then we're actually going to take our turns, which I've already done by taking my gross lift divided by 2 is 336. Then I take 0.336 divided by 50 thousandths because I have 7/16 studs, and that equals 6.71 turns. So I'm going to establish my 90 degrees. I'm going to run my nut down 6.71 turns, and what that does is when my cam comes to mid-lift, I'm going to be back at this 90 degree mark. You can see this is where 90 degrees usually is. When we first initially set it to 90 degrees, if we're going to take half of that away, now it's like this, but when our cam comes to mid-lift or halfway through it, now this side comes down and we're at a perfect 90 degree relationship again, which is exactly where we want to be for this scenario here. So now we'll go downstairs and I'll actually throw this on, and we're going to do it again, and maybe with the actual hardware it'll make more sense. But I wanted to kind of explain what we're after first, so as I'm talking you through it again, you know, guys, I don't know, where'd my cap go? This is going to dry out now. Few items we're going to need here. Of course, we're going to need a push rod length checker. I've had this one for years. It's a comp, and it's done very well. But I also like to, and I urge you guys as well, to double check it with a caliper when we're finished. Of course, we need a rocker, and I use this marker here to draw a center line through the trunnion to the center of the roller tip there, and that's going to help us better visualize that 90 degrees. An Allen key, square stock, anything to use as a straight edge, a paint marker, and then of course our measurements here. So for me it's 671 lift, half of that is 336, and then we're going to use the thread pitch of the rocker stud as a measuring tool. So being at 7/16 of an inch, that's 50 thousandths per turn. So if I take half my lift divided by 50 thousandths, I'm going to adjust that by 6.71 turns. So I'm going to put this on and we'll run through this process quick. Make sure whatever valve a guy wants to do this on that your lifter is installed correctly and it's at the base or the bottom of your cam. I'm going to do it on the number 1 exhaust valve up here because I know that's the case. I've got my push rod length checker adjusted down so there's plenty of clearance here. I'm going to make sure it's seated into the lifter cup. I'm going to install my rocker. These are 1.7 Ultra Golds by Comp, and they're the nicest rocker I've ever owned. I'm going to put the nut on just a half turn, 1 turn, just so it doesn't fall off there. Now I'll grab that Allen key, and remember we know that this retainer is 90 degrees to the valve stem, so we're going to want to line up this line here through our trunnion and roller tip to this line here, the flat surface on the retainer. So I'm going to take my Allen key, set this on here, and that's the line we're adjusting right there. Just make sure that you're pulling your rocker up firmly into your nut so there's no gap there. And then what we're going to do is just turn this nut until we see this line where we want it, which is about right there. We've now established our initial 90 degrees here, and I don't want you to pay attention to the tip of your rocker arm and where that relation is to the valve stem. It's completely irrelevant right now because we're not at mid-lift. In my case, it's on the very outside edge of the valve tip, and that's okay. At this point, I'm going to let go of this, and we're going to take away half of our lift. And remember, this is a 671 cam, half our lift is 336. We're going to use the rocker stud as our measuring tool. That's a 7/16 at 50 thousandths per turn. So 336 divided by 50 thousandths is 6.71 turns of this nut. I've taken my paint marker, I've put a little dot on here so we can count our turns. So we're going to go 6.71. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's 6, and 7 ones probably almost 3/4, somewhere around there. Now when I lift this up, you're going to see, like we illustrated earlier, this is no longer 90 degrees. And that's okay because this is at the top. I'm going to adjust this push rod out now until we get to 0 lash. 0 lash is when you get slight resistance when you spin it, but you have no up and down movement. I'll show you that really quick. So this is not 0 lash. If I were to keep twisting this, still not there. I've got pressure, I could still spin it. I'm going to back it off, double check this a couple times, right about there. So I could still spin this with my fingers, like that. Okay. We're pretty good right there. Now what I can do is just back this nut off, remove my rocker. We can pull out our push rod and take a measurement. Be careful not to turn this. Guy threw a little piece of tape on here so she don't move on me. Got that wrote down over here, but we're not done yet. You can consult your lifter and push rod manufacturer, but I've always added an additional 50 thousandths to whatever my measurement is to compensate for lifter preload. I'm going to double check that quick by adding 50 thousandths into this, installing it into the engine, setting my lifter preload, and we're going to do the old school valve stem tip test. So again, I've added 50 thousandths into my push rod length checker. I got that installed. I'm at 0 lash, just enough resistance. It's not moving up and down. Now, per the instructions on Comp, I usually go 3/4 of a turn, but it's asking for half. So I'm going to put my wrench up here. And I'm going to bring this around half a turn. Just like that. Now, we can roll the engine over. Probably 2 times is going to be enough. And then we'll look at our roller travel path on the valve stem tip here. Now keep your peeper hooked in here. While I turn this engine over, you're going to see this rocker come back into a 90-degree relationship at mid-lift. I'll be dipped. Bingo. We'll go one more. Looking down in the valley here and make sure I'm on the base right there. Now we'll pull this off and take a look at our travel path. Well, I don't know about you fellers, but that looks pretty dead center to me. Well, there we go. We've established the push rod length here by first figuring out proper rocker arm geometry, and remember, this is a result of that. This seems like quite a process, but for maximum performance and safety and reliability of your engine, this is the way to do it. I'm going to head down to the watering hole where I get cell service, call up comp cams, and get a set of these on the way here and now. I got her flopped over here and snipped on the oil pump, and I actually ordered a kit. So it came with the pump, the gasket, the intermediate shaft, a pickup screen, an oil pan, and a one-piece oil pan gasket. The nice thing about that is, you know, it all plays nice together. I don't have to worry about fitment with my pickup screen or anything like that. And lo and behold, the oil pump and intermediate shaft is actually a Melling. It's just rebranded Summit. So that was a nice surprise. It even came with the spring here. It comes at standard volume. If you want to snag that up to high volume, you could respring it. I'm not, but some engines are built at different tolerances where that might benefit you. I got this torqued down to 65 foot-pounds, and again, I use the ARP stud bolt there. Let's talk about oil pans for a second, and I'm going to go ahead and throw that on as well. If a feller's building the rig just to ease down, play bingo and whatnot, you could just go with the stock style pan. But if you're doing any street strip, drag racing, rally course, off-roading, it actually does matter what pan you pick, because guy can get some features built into them nowadays that help out. So this is a stock style pan here. We've got some openings to let that oil travel back down underneath this. And what this is doing is trying to keep a majority of the oil down into the rear sump here where that pickup screen and pump can grab it, so you don't lose any oil pressure. This here is a really old style street strip pan, and you can see here it's quite a bit deeper than a factory one. So this is a higher capacity, and then this comes back farther, and again under heavy acceleration that oil wants to walk up, and this is going to help keep it down into that pickup tube so you're not losing oil pressure. This here is a new street style pan. And if a guy hooks his peepers in close enough, you'll see that it's just a stock pan that someone came over here and snipped off the bottom and snagged on a new one. So it's a larger sump area for more capacity. And then we've got two other features in here a guy wanted. One is this here scraper, and the guy can get his hand into there, see? And the other one is this trapdoor down here. This does three main things for us, and they all kind of happen in one swift motion. As the torque twister's in here spinning, it's grabbing oil and splashing it up. So that creates rotating mass. This here is going to scrape off that excess rotating mass, drive it into the front sump, which will come through the trapdoor into the rear. So we've reduced excess rotating mass, and by driving it back here faster, we're going to keep oil temperature down and maximize the amount of oil that our pump is getting to. This trapdoor, basically what that's doing is also, think of it like a dam or a floodgate. It's keeping the most oil in the rear of the pan as possible. So under heavy acceleration, oil comes back into this area. When this fills up enough, the weight shuts the door, keeps oil into the pump. Or under heavy deceleration, of course this door swings shut too. The oil doesn't rush to the front of the pan. It's going to keep a nice pocket in here. So when a guy is swinging cookies, donuts, circles, cubes, globes, whatever, guy's going to have a lot of pressure coming back, and I might break, and then I'm going to hit a wall. So it's important that I keep as much oil back here as possible. They do have special ones for road course. They usually look like just a little square, and they're going to have trap doors all around in here and a bunch of other boogie traps, and I don't know, they're super complicated. But this one's going to work just fine for me. And like I say, it came as a whole kit, which is nice. And then it's got this one piece seal here. And I went ahead and grabbed some new hardware because, quite frankly, I don't know where I put the bolts when I took that one off. Go on ahead and spend the extra $7.24 up to about $13.76 and upgrade on your gasket. Get one of these one piece. Them cork and gasket ones always leak at the timing cover or right back here, and then folks are always gooping in extra RTV and it just becomes a mess. I like this pump a lot because the screen actually bolts right to the pump housing And it comes with different size bushings in here to where a guy can get that leveled up where you want it. And that makes it so there's no chance that this pickup tube and screen is going to come off. And I know that sounds like something that probably never happens, but it does. This is the 350 that came out of Independence. And the pickup tube was lying in the oil pan. And somehow this engine went hundreds of miles with that screen laying in the bottom of the pan. So it absolutely does and can happen. So this is just some extra insurance to make sure that we always have constant oiling to this thing. I'm just double checking to make sure that this is going to seat correctly. There's these little nubs on the front here I got to get lined up. And the other thing I'm listening for is to make sure that I have clearance in my pan. And I do. If you're a worrier, this would be the last time to get in there and double check your torque specs on your main caps and your connecting rods, but I put the red dots on her, so I'm good to go. Well, she's on and torque-lated up 12 foot-pounds. Try to avoid going until your ears get hot. You're most likely just going to cause a leak, but it's looking sharper than Meryl Streep's nose, and I ain't kidding you. Before you throw your rockers on, you want to give them a bath and some mineral spirits or something like that. Make sure they're really clean. And then I put a little bit of that valve train assembly spray on the trunnion and also the valve stem tips here. After I get these on, I'll go back around one more time, set the poly locks on. Just, you know, loosely for now. Almost finished up with the valve train here. We know we have the correct rocker arm geometry. We also know and confirm we have the right push rod length. The final step that I've got to do here is just put some lifter preload into it. And we're going to do that on this engine at 0 lash. In about 3/4 of a turn I decided to go on the adjuster nut or the poly lock. That varies by build, so just pay attention for your application. So what is lash? Lash is the distance between the roller tip and the valve stem. And for me that's 0, which means just making contact. So I'm going to show you my way of adjusting hydraulic lifter preload, and I promise you it's the easy way. In fact, my 10-year-old has done it, literally. Now you can put it at top dead center, adjust your valves, rotate it over, do the remainder, but it's easy to get lost. It's easy to not understand what valve is doing what. And if you have an intake on it, it gets even more confusing. And if you get interrupted or got to run to the fridge for a cold snack, no, that's just me, probably. But anyway, we don't need to overcomplicate it. I learned this way when I was knee-high to a horse, watching my dad do it on his race car right in the pits. And lo and behold, pretty much every racer and engine builder was doing it this way. And it makes sense. So I'm going to show you really quick, in detail, how to set your hydraulic lifter preload, and this works on any hydraulic lifter, whether it's a roller, a flat tappet, Ford, Mopar, GM, Buick, it doesn't matter. If it's hydraulic pushrod engine, this method will work, and I promise you it's the fastest, easiest, and most accurate way to do it. Okay, so first thing we need to do is go around and set all of these at 0 lash, and that's really easy with these poly locks. Just keep screwing your nut down here until you have no up and down movement, and you can rotate the push rod between your fingers. And I'm going to do this on all of them really quick, and then I'll show you up close. Don't even mind where the engine's at in its rotation. Doesn't matter if it's at top dead center or where it's at right now. Just go around and adjust all these to 0 lash. I'm going to loosen this up. See how this push rod has up and down movement? That means you have movement on the opposite side, so your lash is greater than 0. Remember, we want this to just be making contact, but not greater than that. So just keep turning this nut down until you get no up and down movement. Then I like to shake these a little bit, just make sure everything is seated. Also make sure your push rod is in the lifter cup down here properly. Still have a little bit of movement. A little bit more. Okay, now I don't really have up and down movement. It goes side to side, that's fine. We're looking for up and down, and I don't have it. Now I'm going to take and roll the push rod between my fingers. And what we're feeling for is resistance rolling it. So right now it's really easy. And if I just turn this a little bit, now I have pressure on there. That's about right where I want to be. You don't want to go greater than that. And that's going to be 0 lash out here. And I'm going to do that with all of these, like I said. So give me a minute here and I'm going to work my way around. No up and down. A little bit of resistance. And of course, if you don't have poly locks, you're just going to have that nut on the outside. So just slowly move your ratchet around. Questions so far? Ooh, that's a good one. No, you do not need to pump your lifters up. That's a wives' tale. That's like standing crankshafts on end, make them bend, or putting batteries on concrete, zap them. No. It actually works against you because your valves will be trying to open if you have pumped up lifters. Also, some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, some of these lifters are on the top of the cam or the top of the lobe here. Yes, that's correct. What we've done now is set everything to 0 lash as it sits. But I'm going to take and roll the engine over 90 degrees, right there. Now I'm going to go through this again. And I'm going to look for any that are loose. Some of these have quite a bit of pressure. They're already trying to open a valve. See, this one's loose. Snug it down. I'm going to go through here again. And I'm going to look for any loose ones. See, look at this one. It was at 0, now it's not. So I'm going to bring this down again to 0 lash. Now we're going to do this several times until we go through the entire rotation twice. And what we're going to end up doing is checking these multiple times for 0 lash and setting them to that. And then at the very end, we're going to set the lifter preload. See, this guy's really loose now. Bring him back down to 0. Right about there. Good, good, good. Let's rotate it again. 90 degrees. Bring this guy, so he's on the heel of the cam now. Bring him down to 0. No up and down movement. Just roll between your fingers. So I'm going to keep doing this process, turning at 90 degrees, 90 degrees, 90 degrees, until I go 2 times all the way around. Keep setting them all to perfect 0 lash. The nice thing is, guys, if you need to quit for the night or the day, go to lunch, take a phone call, order parts, it doesn't matter where you start or where you stop. It doesn't matter what valve is open, what valve is closed, where are you at, doesn't matter. Just come back, make sure they're all 0 lash, roll the engine over 90 and just keep going. So by now you guys have probably figured out, by going around twice and checking the lash over and over and over, effectively what we did was set the lash to 0 as soon as the lifter hit the heel of the cam, and on the second time around we've double checked it. Setting the lash when the lifter is at the top of the cam, all we were doing is taking up the slack to kind of keep everything together. Now every single one of these we know, because we just double checked it, is at 0 lash. Some of them are taunt, some of them still spin. Depends on where the lifter is on the cam. Don't pay any attention to that. Now setting your preload is just as easy. All we're going to do, start in the back or start in the front, start wherever you want. I'm just going to take each and every single poly lock and I'm going to go 3/4 of a turn and I'm going to drop my set screw in. I don't need to rotate the engine anymore. Half, 3/4, half, about 3/4, and just keep going down, every single one. Doesn't matter what order you do these in, just don't do them twice. So I'm just going to go down one side like this, and then go back down the other side. So now what we're doing is setting that preload on every single one. You can do this out of the vehicle, you can do this in the vehicle. Again, it doesn't matter if it's a flat tappet or a roller. Doesn't matter if it's Ford, GM, Dodge, whatever. If it's a pushrod engine with a hydraulic lifter, this method's going to work and it's going to be correct. Final step that I'm going to do here is torque these poly locks to 20 foot-pounds, and that's going to drive that set screw into that rocker arm stud and just make doubly sure that it doesn't go anywhere. And this is it, guys. No counting rotations, no understanding where the valves are at. There's no need. You don't have to do firing orders, nothing. We've set 0 valve lash And then we've put exactly the same amount of preload on every single push rod and lifter. Well, that's it. Valve train is done. If I went a little too quick for a guy or you want to go through this again, I have a whole nother video dedicated to adjusting hydraulic lifters. That's somewhere in the playlist. Just search hydraulic lifter adjustment. And I go through that same process on a small block Chevy, and it's pretty much nothing but that. Before I dump some oil in here and put the intake on, I gotta do some house cleaning, a couple odds and ends. I got an oil filter adapter I gotta put in, and I'm gonna use a Wix racing filter. I got a fuel pump block off plate I gotta put in, and a timing tab. Can't see nothing. I wonder how much torque on these. I'm just gonna go with all of it. I'm going to pour my braking oil right in the valley here. It'll lubricate the cam on its way down, get some on the distributor gear back here. You can even shoot some up into the timing cover here. We can get our gears. I think a guy's going to shut her down here and call this a long block. Coming up in part 3, we'll doll it up with some accessories, intake, valve covers, water pump, lightning system back here. We'll talk about total costs, and then of course, we're going to chain this thing in a dyno and see what kind of power it makes. Thanks guys for watching. We'll see you next time.